Do take a seat if you haven't already. Thank you, band, for leading us there. We are, as a church, if you've been here before, you will probably know we've been looking at the Gospel of John. If you don't worry. We're going through the Gospel of John because this year, as I've said a number of times, our focus is Jesus, which may sound crazy for a church, but believe it or not, some may not have that as their focus. But the reason we've done that is because obviously you may have noticed, depending on how you arrive here this morning, the very exciting, the fact that the new build is starting to take place, the steels are up and things like that, and it's all very exciting. It was also very exciting because if it happened to have rained this weekend, some water might have got in, but it hasn't. So I'm very grateful for that. But we want to focus on Jesus because our focus is not the building, our focus is on him. And so we're going through the Gospel of John and we're just trying to understand more of who Jesus is. And right now we're up to John 6. And so I'm going to be looking at sort of the first 15 verses of John 6. If you've got a Bible, you can follow along. If not, don't worry, I'll read it all out. That's absolutely fine. And it's a story that's very, very well known. Even if you probably haven't been around church circles much, you might have had this taught in school at some point. It's often called things like the feeding of the 5,000, things like that. But we're going to sort of look at this passage together and see what we can gain from it and see what we can learn about Jesus from this passage. Because as I say, our focus is him. So I'm going to read out John 6, 1 to 15. So sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in the place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. I say, it's a pretty well-known story of what happened. And it's a fascinating story. There's all sorts of things going on. In fact, it's a story that is so well known. It's the only miracle of Jesus that appears in all 4 of the Gospels. Each of the Gospels has this story included. And in John's Gospel, this story is presented as the 4th of these 7 signs he's showing, where these miraculous deeds are there, and they're supposed to point us to something greater than the deeds themselves and show us something about who Jesus is. And this is exactly what's happening to those present at the time. They're starting to speculate on who Jesus is. One of the last comments they make is, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." This incident is taking them back to a time long, long ago that they would have known about. They, at this point, are thinking he could be Moses, the promised Messiah. Maybe he's something to do with Moses. And there's some significance here that we often miss. There's these almost throwaway comments in John's Gospel. In verse 4, the Jewish Passover festival was near. What's that got to do with it? Why has John included that? Well, that'll become more clear as we go through the rest of John 6. Next week, we've got a guy coming to preach, Dave. he part owns the building company out the front, so he's going to be preaching on the rest of this passage, or some of more of this passage, and you'll start to see why the Passover was significant. Why the time of the Passover? Because what Jesus has been doing at this time is he's been taking various things, and at this point he's looking at the various ceremonies, so he's looking at the Passover and showing actually how he has come to fulfill certain things. And so even in your mind as you read this, as you're looking at bread, he is taking the people back to a time when God provided for his people in the desert by providing bread for them for 40 years. He is trying to take the people back to a time, but show them actually now what came from God, I can do the same. He is again showing us that he is the Son of God. He's again pointing to something so much bigger than what the people were expecting. And so it's fascinating. And we get this scene, and it's a scene where if you are British, you will probably hate it because there's a crowd. And there's too many people there. I was out on Friday night at Theo had a cricket social, a Skittles evening. A crowd of people there, and it was hilarious because there was a point where they did a raffle in this evening. And as soon as the raffle came, the parents just gave their raffle tickets to the kids, and the kids were like a swarm around this guy, this poor guy, who was trying to read the raffle ticket numbers out and prizes, literally just waiting to get in. They were surrounding him. And Jesus has this, but he has an even greater crowd. This guy only had about 15 kids around him. Could you imagine 5,000 men plus women and children coming out? What would you do? If that was coming towards you, what would your reaction be? Most of us would leg it. But here's Jesus. I love it. Great crowd have followed him. He goes up on the mountainside and just sits down. Pretty relaxed, isn't it? They're coming, I'm just going to sit there. And once again, it's got this sort of feeling where it's just a normal situation that's happening. I'm just going to sit down with my disciples. It's almost like if you go to, a Moores Valley on a summer's day, you'll see various groups sat down on the grass having picnics together, won't you? That's what happened. Jesus has taken the high spot. I've sat down. The crowd are coming. I'm just going to sit down with my people, and we're going to chat, and we're going to enjoy some time together. But then he suddenly realizes, hang on, these people are coming, but don't look like they got anything with them. Because the area he was in was a very impoverished area. The fact that they have barley bread tends to show you that was the bread of the poor. These people that were coming to see Jesus, they had nothing. And so Jesus here sees this crowd, and he's like, Philip, we need to get some bread for these people. What are we going to do? There's no delivery slots left from Tesco to come out today. What are we going to do? How are we going to get bread for all these people? And Philip's instant response, and you've got to remember at this point, he's been following Jesus a while, but even one of his closest, one of his disciples, is the crowd seem to understand that Jesus can do something miraculous, but Philip here doesn't. He goes, well, do you know how much that'll cost us? We haven't got that kind of money. What are we going to do? We can't even buy enough for everyone to have a bite, even if we had a half a year's wages. Philip here hits panic mode and almost forgets who Jesus is. And forgets what Jesus is capable of doing. Don't forget, this is after he's been healing people. This is what it is. And so we have this almost beautiful moment where Jesus is still trying to teach his disciples who he is, and yet they're still not kind of getting it. But Jesus doesn't get cross in any way. It tells us Jesus was just doing this to test him, to see what he would do. Not doing it in a nasty way to catch him out, but just trying to see, do they yet understand who I am? Do they know what I'm capable of? But then another one of his disciples, and I'd love to know what's happening at this point, as he was talking to Philip, they must be thinking, oh no, he's going to come to me next. And are they in the crowd? Are they going, right, who's got what? Who's got what? Right, coffee. Right, what else have we got? Water. What else can we, oh no, has anyone got any other, oh no, you got some eggs. We got some eggs? Great. Oh, okay, what can we make? Okay. And then one of them comes back, Jesus, I found coffee and eggs. No, that's not what he said. He said, I found 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. This kid's got them. Can you imagine the scene? The disciples with a panic on their, as Jesus is, oh, Philip, what have you got? Oh, he's going to come to me next. I've got to do something. But how far are these going to go? And then Jesus, very normally, I love it. He's like, just get everyone to sit down. Just get everyone to sit down. Could you imagine a crowd that big? Have you ever tried, even you lot, just getting you lot to do one thing is hard enough. could you imagine 5,000 men, plus women and children, trying to get them to do something without any kind of microphone or amplification? Just get them to sit down. They'll be all right. Have them sit down. And there was plenty of grass. Great, thanks for the detail. There was plenty of grass there. So they sit down. And he takes the loaves, gives thanks, and distributed. And I also laughed at this. He distributed to those who were seated. I would love to have seen those who are not seated. I'm not sitting down. You're not telling me what to do. You're going without then, aren't you? It's very British here at this point. If you're not going to follow the rules and do as we tell you, you are not having the food. I've never noticed that before until I read it the other day. I was like, he only gave food to those who were seated. Could you imagine the rebels at that point? So I think I'm learning something here. For those of you who don't pay attention, you're going without from now on, okay? When we have a barbecue in the summer, if you're not doing what you're told, you can have baby bread but no meat in there, okay? And so you've got this almost scene, you can almost not imagine it, on this hillside next to a lake where Jesus is feeding these people, and you've got this amazing thing happen where these 5 loaves and 2 fish become enough food for thousands and thousands of people who are seated down and have come to see Jesus because they have heard that he has performed miracles. And then when they have enough to eat, we have this moment where he's like, well, gather everything up. Let's not waste anything. And they gather up and fill 12 baskets. Not just they end up with 5 pieces and 2 fish again, 5 pieces alone and 2 fish. They end up with 12 baskets of food. I mean, that's incredible what's happened here. And then the people start to say, well, surely this is the prophet. Because this is, as I say, taking them back to the time when we had them fed in the desert and where they saw people like Moses, and they thinking, well, surely this is who he is. And then Jesus knows that, and he says, I'm going to withdraw. He disappears. He's like, I don't want to be made king by force. See, what the people were looking for was someone who was just going to take them out of where they were. But Jesus wasn't yet ready to show them fully who he was. And so he disappears. And once again, there's something here where you're going, well, if you're Jesus, if you're starting to gather a crowd, surely you're going, well, this is good, right? They're getting my message. You know, and you look at churches today. We like to gather a crowd, don't we? The bigger your church, the bigger your crowd, the better you are. Jesus does the polar opposite. When the crowd gathers, he disappears. It's not about the people who aren't actually after it for following me. He wants the people who want to follow him, not just the people who want to have a miracle done and disappear. That's what Jesus is after here. And so we have this story, and it teaches us some really important things about Jesus. Firstly, it teaches that Jesus is a miracle doer. And so by this stage, as I say, of his ministry, Jesus had started attracting crowds, had been coming to him. More and more people have been coming because they've been seeing the things he'd been doing, or they'd been hearing the things they've been doing. People have been updating their Facebook posts, and people have been coming out to see what Jesus was doing. Okay? News was traveling around the area, and they all wanted to come and see what was happening. And he taught them on both sides of the Lake Galilee itself. And some of them had seen them, and some of them had heard, and it caused these people to stick around. What is going on? Who is this man? I want to see more. And that in itself isn't a bad thing, wanting to see Jesus to do more. But we've got to understand, and we've got to not fall into the trap of we only follow Jesus to see him do miraculous things. Following Jesus is about relationship with him, not just about the miracles. And this was the problem with the crowd that Jesus found. They just wanted to see him do something miraculous. Almost like a performer on a stage. We just come out to see you do your trick, and then we'll be satisfied. But Jesus doesn't want that. He wants relationship. Where does he disappear? To be with himself. Relationship with the Father. With the disciples. Relationship with the disciples. He wants relationship. You see, the signs are not in an end in themselves. They're meant to get people's attention. Same as a miracle today should be. It's to get someone's attention, but the attention is not supposed to stay on the signs, but rather to point us to Jesus. You know, if we were to pray for someone to get healing today, and they did get healed, what are we celebrating? Are we celebrating the fact that that person is healed, or are we celebrating the fact that that points us to the King of Kings who has performed it? It should be pointing us to Jesus. Yeah, we can celebrate with the person is healed from something, but if that's all it is, then we've missed out what's happening. We've missed the point of it in the first place. And the challenge for this crowd, and maybe even for us, is we need to say, well, what are we looking at? How do we view Jesus? Are we just coming, hope he's going to do something, we're going to go, wow, go home? Wasn't that cool? Or are we coming to see him and meet with him so that it deepens our relationship with him, and also then we can then share that with other people? How do we see him when we're coming out, this miracle doer? Are we in spectator mode? Are we just one of the crowd that wants to come and see? Just see from a distance? Or are we someone who wants to draw into a personal relationship with Jesus himself? Where are you sat today? Where am I sat today? Do I just come out on a Sunday hoping there's going to be something amazing that happens and God breaks in some way? Or am I coming because I want a personal relationship with Jesus? And if he breaks out in some way, that's amazing, but that's just going to deepen my relationship with him because it's pointing to him and it's all about him. So yes, Jesus is a miracle doer, but let's not lose him in the miracle. And I think that is the danger that can happen. We see the miracle, which is absolutely right if he's doing it, but let's not lose why he might be doing it. It might be to open up a situation where someone denies who Jesus is, but then all of a sudden, it opens a conversation. It opens a door for something to point them to Jesus. You know, we want to be a church where we're praying for things and God is working in amazing ways and we're seeing lives transformed. We want to be a church that has all that happening, but we want it to then get people going, how is that happening? Who's what? And we're pointing them to Jesus. That's who we've got to be. We don't just want to be seeing miracles for the sake of a miracle. We don't just want to be seeing things happen for the sake of it. We want to be saying, well, that's because of Jesus. That's because of who he is, not because of us, not because of me. But the second thing we see from this about Jesus is not only does he do miracles, he's also a provider. And it's a really important thing for us to grasp when we consider who Jesus is. Okay? There's this large crowd of people that have come towards him and only a small amount of food. And we see Jesus miraculously multiply this food in a miraculous way. And there was plenty for everyone. And it's parallel to a story from Exodus 16 where God miraculously provided the people of Israel with bread from heaven. And Jesus is recreating a sign that his heavenly Father did in the Old Testament. And it's pointing towards, again, his relationship with the Father. I'm the Son. Remember in the previous chapter, if you were here last week, it said, whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. He is pointing to his sonship again of who he is. We see Jesus provide in an amazing way. But it helps us to go, well, if Jesus provided for those that have less, how much should we do? This is a real cultural challenge for us today. It's a real cultural challenge because we live in a very different setting to this world in the Bible in these days. We don't live in community in the same way. We live in all our own homes that are often very separate. And we don't maybe see always those around us where there's a need. What would you do if someone came and knocked on your door and said, your neighbor, I've got nothing to eat. I'm hungry. How would you respond? Oh, I'm really sorry. Or would you just go and find something and give it to them at the door and say, here you go? Would you invite them in? What would your response be? Jesus here could have gone, can't believe they're following us. Let's get back on the lake quickly, get out of the way, and then we can have some quiet time. But he doesn't do that. He gets everyone to sit down, and he provides food for them in a miraculous way. But not only does he provide food, he seems to be there distributing the food. If you read the passage, he's there, handing it out. I think there's a challenge there for us as well, is even if we see poor people that need food, do we just throw money at it? Not wrong in itself, because money is needed for food and resources, or are we amongst the people? Jesus was there. He gave thanks, but he distributed the bread. He was there. He was like running probably the very first soup kitchen you've ever seen. And he was there distributing the bread. And I guess the challenge for us is, are the poor a problem we're willing to throw money and try and stay away from because we don't want to associate with them? Or are we going to go, well, actually, we want to be amongst these people and not only provide for them, but also be the ones that give it to them, distribute it to them? And that's a challenge for all of us. How do we respond when we know people who are struggling? What do we do as a church going forwards? How do we try and reach out to people in a way that says, we don't just want to give money towards you, but we want to provide for you. We want to actually give it to you. We want to eat with you. You know, there's something about eating together which I think it's just amazing how it creates relationships. You ever sit down and eat with someone, it's amazing. You have a conversation that you might not have if you were just passing, because you've got time together. And as these groups were sat down and Jesus was moving amongst them and distributing them, there had been conversations happening. He'd have been talking, telling those that are not sat down, you're not having food, but also those that were sat down, having conversations. They probably would have been asking him questions. Oh, do another miracle. But he might have been talking to these people. The challenge for us as a church is, are we there? Are we out there doing that? Or not? Or do we sit at home in our own castles? Real challenge here for us. Jesus was a heavenly provider. How can we start to live in that way today? But one other thing I want us to really consider today is how Jesus empowered people in this message. One of the significant features in what he does here is the way Jesus draws other people in. So he draws his disciples in, even though he already had a plan of what he was going to do. He doesn't just go, right guys, this is the plan, just do it. He goes, well, what do you think? He empowers his disciples to go, well, guys, start thinking, how can we solve this problem? There's a problem. There's a mob of hungry people. What are you going to do? He asked Philip where they could buy enough bread. And it was Andrew highlighted the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He involves other people. Now, this is great news because it means we're all involved. You are not just a person filling a seat. The good news is, in our context, I don't have to do all the work. That's great news. Okay? It means he empowers all of us to do something. You know, he empowered his disciples, who he knew at the moment didn't fully grasp who he was. Go and try and solve something. Go and try and figure something out. And you see it as you go through the Gospels, where eventually he sends them out 2 by 2. Go out. Things I've taught you, go and do it, go and do it, go and do it. Jesus empowers people. You know, and when you think about it like this, actually it's quite a significant expression of faith from Andrew. Andrew comes to him and he's like, I've got the answer, but I've got 5 bits of bread and 2 fish. I don't know what to do next. But he started thinking in a way of, well, here's maybe part of an answer, but I don't know what to do with it. And also even, there's probably a step of faith from the boy who gave his lunch up as well. Well, have this, maybe this will help. Maybe this will be able to help. Maybe you'll be able to do something with this. You see, all these different people in this story had the opportunity of being involved in this divine provision from Jesus. Yeah, we focus on the miracle that Jesus has done, and that's not wrong. We focus on the fact that he gave thanks and he distributed out and there were 12 baskets left afterwards. That's not wrong. But let's not miss out that Jesus empowered the people who were around him to step out and to try and be involved in this as well. He loves to involve ordinary people in his work. He involves a boy. Now you've got to think about it, in this society, kids were almost, we don't really want to know about them until they're adults. They're almost a nuisance. You've got to remember who his disciples were. These weren't the top of the top people. These aren't all the CEOs of the companies, the billionaires of the world. He has taken the poor, the uneducated, and he's now involving them in his work. That is what the Son of the Father is doing right here. He is taking people who most people in today's society would go, they haven't really got much about them. And he's going, You try and feed that crowd. You try and do that. Let's see how you get on. You see, he loves to involve ordinary people. You might be sat here today thinking, oh, I can't do anything for God. I can almost guarantee you are probably more educated than any of his disciples. I can probably guarantee you have more provisions than any of the people in this story. And if God can use them, the great news is he can use you. And that is something that should hopefully fill you with excitement. God can do things with you. He can use you. He loves to involve people. As I say, as you go through the Gospels, you see more and more his disciples, they grow in number, and he sends them out, doing the very things he does. And then he tells them, you will do even greater things than these. And yet, what do we find? We sometimes find that most people's expression of what it is to follow Jesus is one which involves being a spectator like the crowd, rather than a participant. To be a follower of Jesus, it means not just being a member of the crowd. It means playing your part. It means stepping out. It means bringing whatever you think your small offering is and seeing how God can multiply it. And we don't always know what that's going to look like. I don't always know what that's going to look like, But sometimes I love what I do. And I love trying to help people take steps of faith. I love it. And saying, well, you could be doing this, or you could be involved with this, or, oh, have you considered this area? I love doing that and seeing people take the steps of faith. But could you imagine if, as a church, we were all encouraging people, each other, to do that? Oh, I've noticed this about you. Have you ever considered X, Y, Z, whatever it may be? And it could include all sorts of things: time, gifting, finance. I don't know what it could include. But what is it that you've got? What is it that you have that you may think is small? But Jesus doesn't really care how big it is. He fed several thousand people on 5 loaves and 2 fish. Comparatively, your offering is probably already bigger than what this boy had. So don't rule yourself out, because I've been there before. I've been sat in those seats where someone says something like this, and they're already sat there saying, well, I've got nothing. If that's been your response today, come see me afterwards, and we'll talk about it, and we'll tell you what you have. Okay? And we'll figure out a way that God can use your gifting. I guarantee there is a way. I guarantee it. Okay? There is no one who God cannot use, because God has created you in his image, and therefore he has created you for a time such as this, and he has a gifting for you. So I want to encourage you. Bring whatever it may have, no matter how small you think it is. And if you're not sure what to do with it, come and speak to me. But as well is, I want us to be praying. Jesus here provided for many people. There may even be some of you here today who have provision needs. There may be some of you that are struggling to make ends meet. I don't know all of your needs. I don't know where you're at. I don't have access to, who gives to the church. I don't know who gives, and so sometimes you might not give if you're struggling. I don't know. I don't see that. But I know that we have a God who can provide needs for you. I know of stories where people have literally been praying around dinner tables, and there have been knocks on doors, and there have been open doors and then bags of food on doorsteps. Friends of mine, that's happened to them. God wants to provide. It may not always be in the way you expect. It may not be your favorite takeaway turns up at the door one night because you're hungry. That may not be how God is going to work in your situation. Okay, it's not like he's just sat there on Just Eat in the evening, just scrolling through, seeing what the offers are. But God can provide for us when we are struggling. And that may be you today. You might be thinking, well, I'm one of these people. I've got nothing. Okay? We can pray for that. We can be involved. And what we're going to do in a second is we are going to pray for others. Because I think as well as praying for provision, I want to encourage you all to think about how I can step out for him. How I, as an ordinary person, can do work for him. What does it mean for him to work through you and I? And it may look different for every single one of us. You know, it may not be something you've ever considered. You may think, like I said, I've got nothing. I do well to get up in the morning. But there may be more to you than you realize. And God yet just hasn't unearthed it.